The buckboard lurched, throwing Elara against the hard wooden seat for what felt like the 100th time. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated her dark traveling dress, her worn valise, and the two bright hopes she had clutched for 3 long weeks. The driver, a taciturn man named Jeb, had spoken little since picking her up from the train station, a bustling point of clamor and steam that now felt a lifetime away. Out here, the land stretched, vast and indifferent, under a sky too large for a lone woman with a thinning purse and a photograph of a man she'd never met. Silas Blackwood. His letters had been spare but kind, promising a modest but secure life, a partnership. He needed a wife, she needed a future. It had seemed a fair exchange. Jib finally pulled the weary horses to a halt. This is it. Blackwood Place. Elara looked. Her heart, already a nervous bird in her chest, seemed to plummet. The modest farm was a collection of weathered buildings leaning at precarious angles, the paint long surrendered to sun and storm. A broken fence sagged like a weary sigh. No smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, which squatted in the overgrown yard like a wounded animal. There was a stillness about the place, a deep, unnerving silence that swallowed the clatter of the buckboard and the jingle of the harness. No welcoming figure stood on the porch. No dog barked a greeting. "Mr. Blackwood, he is expecting me." Elara's voice was small, almost lost in the vastness. Jeb shifted uncomfortably, not meeting her eyes. He climbed down, retrieved her valise, and set it in the dust. "Reckon you best go see for yourself." He handed her a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed and creased. "He left this. For you." A cold dread, sharper than the prairie wind, snaked around Elara. The letter felt heavy in her hand, a portent. Jeb was already turning the horses, eager to depart. "Wait," she called, but he merely touched his hat, a gesture more of dismissal than respect, and urged the team forward. The buckboard rattled away, leaving her alone in the profound quiet, the dust settling around her like a shroud. She clutched the letter, her gaze fixed on the house. This was not the beginning she had envisioned. This felt like an ending. Swallowing her fear, she took a hesitant step towards the porch, the silence broken only by the crunch of her worn boots on the dry earth and the frantic beat of her own heart. The door was slightly ajar. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. The air that met her was stale, cold, and carried the faint, unmistakable scent of neglect. And then she heard it, a tiny, muffled sob from within the shadowed interior. Her breath hitched. The sob came again, fragile and forlorn. Elara stepped inside, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The front room was sparsely furnished, a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a cold hearth. And then she saw them. 7 pairs of eyes, wide and wary, stared back at her from various corners of the room. Children. Ranging from a girl on the cusp of womanhood, clutching a bundled infant, down to a small boy peeking from behind a chair leg. The infant was the source of the whimpering. The eldest girl, whose face was a mask of grief and premature responsibility, tightened her hold on the baby. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice raw. Elara looked from their pinched faces to the letter in her hand, its seal still unbroken. The hope she had carried so carefully had shattered, its pieces glinting sharply in the dim light. The silence returned, thick with unspoken questions and the crushing weight of an arrival that was clearly a terrible mistake. She opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she possibly say to these children, to this desolate place, to the ghost of a promise that had led her here? The letter. She had to read the letter. Her fingers, clumsy with apprehension, fumbled with the wax. It cracked, and she unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was spidery, weak. "My dearest Elara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have failed you in the most profound way. I am gone. A sudden sickness, the doctor said." There was no time. Elara's vision blurred. Gone. Silas Blackwood was dead. The word swam before her. "My children. Martha, my eldest, she tries, but she is too young for such a burden. Thomas, Lily, Rose, Samuel, Finn, and the babe, Clara. They have no one else. I had hoped. I had prayed you would be their mother. I know this is not what you agreed to. An impossible request. But I beg you, consider them. There is little money, the farm is struggling, but it is theirs. Forgive me. Or the letter slipped from her numb fingers, drifting to the dusty floorboards. 7 pairs of eyes remained fixed on her, mirrors of loss and a fragile, desperate query. Martha, the eldest, perhaps 16, her face gaunt, eyes red-rimmed but defiant, shifted the baby on her hip. Clara! The baby's whimpers had subsided into shallow, restless breaths. Next to Martha stood a boy, Thomas, maybe 14, his expression unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked like he carried the weight of the world on his thin shoulders. 2 younger girls, identical with their wide, frightened eyes and tangled fair hair, Lily and Rose, perhaps 10, clung to each other. A sturdy-looking boy of about 8, Samuel, scowled from beneath a thatch of unruly brown hair, his small jaw set in a miniature version of defiance. And peeking from behind Samuel, the smallest boy, Finn, no more than 6, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as he stared. Ilara's gaze swept over them, over the bare room, the cold hearth. The air was thick with the smell of dust, unwashed bodies, and despair. Her own carefully constructed plans, her hopes for a new life, lay in ruins at her feet, as tattered as the curtains hanging limply at the grimy windows. She could leave. No one would blame her. She had signed up to be a wife, not a rescuer of orphans on a failing farm. The train station wasn't impossibly far. She still had a little money. But their faces. The raw vulnerability in those young eyes, the silent plea that transcended Martha's overt hostility. Silas Blackwood's last, desperate hope. Forgive me, he had written. Ilara bent slowly, her joints stiff from the journey and the sudden, crippling shock, and picked up the letter. Her own future was a terrifying blank, but in this moment, there seemed even more precarious. Ilara sank onto the edge of a hard chair, the letter crinkling in her grip. The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing in on her. The children watched, unblinking. Martha's gaze was the hardest, a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. So, he sent for you, Martha said, her voice flat, devoid of welcome. It wasn't a question. And now he's dead, Ilara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She looked at the baby, Clara, whose small face was pale. When did he pass? 3 days ago, Thomas answered, his voice quiet but steady. He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Ilara and his younger siblings, a silent protector. The preacher came. Said a few words. We buried him up on the hill. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the stark reality. 3 days. These children had been alone, truly alone, for 3 days, with their father newly in the ground. Her own grief for a man she'd never known was a pale shadow compared to the raw sorrow that emanated from them. I am Ilara, she managed, her voice hoarse. Ilara Vance. No one responded. The names from the letter echoed in her mind, Martha, Thomas, Lily, Rose, Samuel, Finn, Clara. A litany of need. She looked around the room again, this time with a more searching gaze. Dust lay thick on every surface. A few meager vegetables sat in a bowl on the table, a couple of withered potatoes, a shriveled onion. The air was cold, and the woodbox beside the hearth was nearly empty. What had they been eating? How had they been managing? Are you hungry? She asked, the question feeling inadequate, absurd in the face of their overwhelming situation. Samuel, the defiant one, finally spoke. Ain't none of your business. Martha shot him a look, but there was no real heat in it, only weariness. We manage. Ilara doubted it. She rose, her body aching, her spirit bruised, but a sense of purpose, fragile yet insistent, began to stir within her. The initial shock was receding, replaced by a dull ache and the first pricklings of a grim resolve. Leaving them was an option, yes. But the image of walking away, of adding her abandonment to their fresh grief, felt like a betrayal too profound to contemplate, even if the promise made to her had been broken by death. The letter, she said, holding it up. Mr. Blackwood, he asked me to stay. To help with you. Martha's chin lifted. We don't need your help. Or your pity, perhaps not, Ilara said softly. But right now, I think we all need a fire. And something warm to eat. She walked towards the hearth, her movement slow but deliberate. She picked up the few remaining pieces of wood from the box. Is there more wood? And kindling? Thomas hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Out back. By the shed. Show me, Ilara said. He looked at Martha, a silent question in his eyes. Martha shrugged, a gesture of resignation rather than agreement. Thomas led Ilara out the back door into a yard as neglected as the front. A small stack of chopped wood lay beside a dilapidated shed. It wasn't much. Enough for a day, perhaps two. As Thomas gathered an armful, Ilara looked around. A few scraggly chickens pecked listlessly in a dusty run. The vegetable garden was choked with weeds, the earth cracked and dry. This wasn't just a struggling farm, it was a dying one. The task ahead, if she chose to accept it, was monumental. She thought of her small trunk, still sitting in the front room, containing all her worldly possessions, a few dresses, some linens, her mother's worn Bible, and a small bag of coins that wouldn't last long. It was so little to pit against so much. Yet, as she followed Thomas back into the house, the smell of the wood smoke, however faint from the previous fire, and the sight of the children huddled together, sparked something within her. Not hope, not yet. But a stubborn refusal to be completely overwhelmed. She would make a fire. She would find food. One step. Then another. For now, that was all she could think about. The fire caught slowly, spitting and reluctant, much like the children's acceptance of her presence. Ilara worked with a quiet efficiency that belied the turmoil in her heart. She found a mostly clean pot, filled it with water from a bucket Thomas indicated, and set it on the hook over the growing flames. The potatoes and onion, scrubbed and chopped, were meager, but with a little salt she found in a tin, they might make a thin soup. Martha watched her every move, her arms still protectively around Clara, who had begun to fuss again. Lily and Rose huddled together on a small stool, their eyes following Ilara like frightened fawns. Samuel kicked at a loose floorboard, his earlier defiance simmering beneath a wary curiosity. Finn, the youngest boy, ventured a little closer to the hearth, drawn by the promise of warmth. Ilara said little, focusing on the tasks at hand. Words felt inadequate, intrusive. Action was what was needed. She found a dusty broom and began to sweep the worst of the dirt from the floorboards near the hearth, the rhythmic scrape a small, domestic sound in the heavy silence. There's a bit of flour, Thomas offered suddenly, his voice startlingly loud. He pointed to a bin in the corner. And some dried beans. Ilara nodded her thanks. Perhaps later. Soup first. The water began to simmer. She stirred the vegetables, the aroma, thin as it was, filling a small corner of the vast emptiness. She noticed Clara's restless movements, the baby's flushed cheeks. Is the little one unwell? She asked Martha, her voice gentle. Martha's expression tightened. She's teething. And hungry. Ilara looked at the primitive cradle in the corner, its blankets thin and worn. When was she last fed? Martha's gaze dropped. This morning. There's not much milk her own, Ilara presumed. The girl looked exhausted, undernourished herself. Ilara knew little about babies, but she knew they needed constant care, consistent nourishment. Another weight settled upon her. She searched the cupboards, her hope sinking with each empty shelf, each dusty tin. Finally, tucked away at the back, she found a small, unopened can of condensed milk. A relic from a time when Silas Blackwood perhaps had a little extra to spend. It felt like a tiny miracle. This might help, she said, holding it up. Martha looked at the can, then at Ilara, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, suspicion. Or a desperate, unwilling hope? Ilara found a small, chipped bowl and a spoon. She carefully opened the can, diluted a little of the thick, sweet milk with warm water from the pot, testing the temperature on her wrist. She offered the bowl and spoon to Martha. You try. She knows you've. Martha hesitated for a long moment, then slowly took the bowl. She dipped the spoon, brought it to Clara's lips. The baby, after an initial protest, began to suckle weakly, then with more purpose. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the older children. Even Samuel stopped kicking the floorboard. Ilara ladled the thin soup into a few mismatched bowls. It wasn't much, but it was warm. She set a bowl before each child, then one for herself. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire. Ilara watched them. Their hunger was evident in the way they scraped their bowls clean. When they were finished, Lily, one of the twins, shyly brought her empty bowl to where Ilara was washing up in a basin of heated water. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rose followed, a mirror image of her sister, offering the same quiet gratitude. Ilara felt a faint stirring in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first crack in the wall of their shared desolation. Night was falling, painting the single window panes a deep indigo. The wind howled a lonely song around the eaves of the house. Ilara knew she should be terrified, alone in this desolate place with 7 grieving children and an uncertain future. But as she looked at their faces, softened slightly by the firelight and the meager meal, a different emotion began to take root, a fierce, protective resolve. She might have come here for a husband, for a life she thought she understood. But something else had found her. Or perhaps, she had found it. The decision to stay, truly stay, wasn't a conscious thought, not a weighing of pros and cons. It settled over her like the prairie night, vast and undeniable. She was here. And for now, she would not leave them. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the landscape outside the grimy windowpane stark and unforgiving. Ilara had spent a restless night on a thin pallet Martha had reluctantly provided, the sounds of the children's fitful sleep, Clara's occasional whimpers, and the creaks of the old house her constant companions. The weight of her decision, made in the firelit warmth of the previous evening, felt heavier in the harsh light of day. But it did not waver. She rose before any of the children, rekindled the fire, and set about exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. The larder was, as she suspected, pitifully bare. A half-empty sack of flour, a small quantity of beans, some salt, a little sugar, and the remainder of the condensed milk. Not enough to sustain 8 people for more than a few days. Silas Blackwood's letter had mentioned the farm was struggling. It was an understatement. It was starving. She found a ledger on a dusty shelf, Silas's neat, spidery script filling the pages. Entries detailed meager crop yields, tools purchased, debts owed to a general store in the nearest town, a place called Redemption, apparently a day's ride away. The last few entries were shaky, almost illegible. There was no mention of hidden money, no secret savings. Only a litany of hardship. Her own small purse felt very thin indeed. Thomas was the first to emerge, his eyes still clouded with sleep. He stopped short when he saw her already at work, a rag in hand, wiping down the soot-stained mantelpiece. He said nothing, merely fetched the water bucket and headed outside. When he returned, he silently began to chop the remaining wood into smaller pieces for the stove. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a beginning. One by one, the others appeared, drawn by the sounds of activity. Martha, still pale and burdened, but with a fraction less hostility in her eyes. The twins, Lily and Rose, clung together, their gazes darting towards Ilara and then away. Samuel maintained his sullen silence, while Finn, emboldened by the previous night's soup, offered Ilara a shy, gap-toothed smile. Ilara set about making a thin porridge with the last of the oats she discovered in a forgotten canister. As they ate, she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "We need to take stock," she said, "of what we have, and what we need. Thomas, you know the farm. What food is there, besides what's in this kitchen?" Thomas swallowed his mouthful. "Not much. Some potatoes left in the root cellar, but they're starting to sprout. The hens ain't laying much. Maybe a dozen eggs. The vegetable garden. Pa planted it, but he got sick before he could tend it proper, and livestock. Just the chickens. And Bess, the old milk cow. But she went dry a month back. Pa was meaning to sell her. Elara nodded slowly. It was worse than she thought. Survival through the coming winter, which she could feel breathing down the neck of autumn, would be a battle. After their meager breakfast, she proposed a cleaning of the house. A clean space is a healthier space, she said, trying to keep her tone practical, not preachy. Martha scoffed. Healthier? We're like to starve before winter, and you're worried about dust. Dust is one thing we can fight today, Martha, Elara replied evenly. Starvation is a bigger battle, and we'll face that too. But we start here. With what we can manage. To her surprise, Lily and Rose exchanged a look and then, hesitantly, picked up rags Elara offered. Thomas, after a moment, began to carry out a broken chair for mending. Samuel, seeing the others engaged, reluctantly agreed to fetch more water for scrubbing floors. Martha watched, her arms crossed, Clara now sleeping fitfully in the cradle Elara had cleaned and moved closer to the fire. Hours passed in a flurry of unaccustomed activity. Dust flew. Grime was scrubbed away. Windows were washed, letting in more of the pale autumn light. Elara found old lye soap and heated water, insisting the younger children wash properly. There were protests, especially from Samuel, but she was firm. As she worked alongside them, mending a torn curtain, her mind raced. They needed food, desperately. The town, redemption, was the only option. But what would she use for money? And how would she get there? She remembered Jeb, the driver. Perhaps he made regular trips. The thought of facing the town, of explaining her presence, of begging for credit, was daunting. But the sight of Finn, his face scrubbed clean, earnestly trying to help by polishing a tin cup, strengthened her resolve. Later that afternoon, as the house began to feel marginally more like a home, less like a tomb, Finn tugged on her skirt. He held up a small, carved wooden bird, its paint faded. Pa made this, he whispered, his lower lip trembling. For me, Elara knelt, taking the small bird gently. It's beautiful, Finn. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and searching. Will you stay? Pa said. Pa said a lady was coming. To be our new Martha. The innocent question, the raw hope in it, struck Elara to the core. She looked over at Martha, who had heard and whose face was a complicated mask of pain and resentment. Elara met Finn's gaze. I'm here now, Finn, she said softly. I'm here now. It wasn't a promise of forever, not yet. But it was the truth. And for a small, hopeful boy, it seemed to be enough. A few days later, a minor crisis solidified Elara's tentative position within the fragile family unit. Young Samuel, always testing boundaries, had climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft, ignoring Martha's shouted warnings. A crack, a scream, and then a sickening thud. Elara, who had been outside attempting to assess the weed-choked garden, rushed into the barn. Samuel lay on the dusty floor, clutching his arm, his face white with pain and fear. Martha was there first, kneeling beside him, her own face ashen. Don't touch it, Samuel wailed when she reached for his arm. Elara gently pushed Martha aside. Let me see, Samuel. Her voice was calm, authoritative. She ran her fingers lightly over his forearm. It was already beginning to swell, and bent at an unnatural angle. Broken. Thomas, Elara called, her tone urgent but controlled. Fetch me 2 flat pieces of wood from the kindling pile, as straight as you can find. And tear some clean strips from that old sheet in the linen press. Thomas, seeing the gravity of the situation, raced off without a word. Lily and Rose hovered at the barn door, their eyes wide with terror. Finn started to cry. Elara focused on Samuel. It's all right, Samuel. We'll fix it. It will hurt for a bit, but then it will mend. She spoke soothingly, her hand surprisingly steady as she supported his injured arm. Martha watched, her earlier resentment momentarily forgotten, replaced by a helpless anxiety. When Thomas returned with the splints and cloth, Elara set to work. She had learned basic doctoring from her mother, who had been the village healer in their small community back east. Setting a child's broken arm was not unfamiliar to her. With Martha's reluctant help to hold Samuel still, Ilara carefully straightened the limb. Samuel cried out, a sharp, piercing sound, but Ilara held firm, her touch gentle yet inexorable. She bound the arm tightly between the wooden splints. "There," she said, when it was done. "You were very brave, Samuel." His tears were drying, leaving dusty tracks on his pale cheeks. He looked at his splintered arm, then up at Ilara, a new respect dawning in his eyes. Does it still hurt?" Finn whispered from the doorway. "Some," Ilara admitted. "But it will get better. He needs to rest now." Between Ilara and Thomas, they carried Samuel into the house and settled him on the pallet Ilara had been using. Clara, disturbed by the commotion, began to cry. Martha, her composure returning, picked up the baby and began to rock her, her gaze lingering on Ilara with a new, troubled expression. The incident, though frightening, had shifted something in the household dynamic. Ilara had not panicked. She had taken charge, competently and compassionately. Even Martha could not deny the skill with which she had tended to Samuel. Later that evening, as Ilara was checking Samuel's bindings, Thomas approached her quietly. "Pa, he kept a small box," he said, his voice low, "under a loose floorboard in his room. He told me if anything ever happened. He said there might be a little something there." Ilara looked at him, surprised. "Why didn't you say so before?" Thomas shrugged, his gaze dropping. "Didn't know if we could trust you." The unspoken yet hung in the air. Ilara understood. Trust was not given lightly, especially by children who had lost so much. Together, they went into the small, bleak room that had been Silas Blackwood's. Thomas knelt and pried up a specific floorboard. Beneath it lay a small, tin box. Ilara's heart beat a little faster. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded velvet, were a few coins, not many, but more than she possessed, and a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from the general store in Redemption, for a sturdy plough bought and paid for the previous spring. Silas had circled the name of the proprietor, Mr. Albright. Beneath it, he had scrawled, "A fair man." It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. The coins would allow her to buy essential supplies. And the name, Mr. Albright, offered a potential ally in a town of strangers. "Thank you, Thomas," Ilara said, meeting his gaze. This helps a great deal." He nodded, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. He had offered a piece of his father's legacy, a small key to their survival. And in doing so, he had offered her a measure of his trust. As she tucked the box away, Ilara felt a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead was still fraught with peril, but now, at least, she had a few more tools for the journey. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was no longer entirely alone in her efforts. The children were watching, learning, and in their own ways, beginning to reach out. The journey to redemption was long and arduous. Ilara had managed to persuade a passing farmer, Jedediah Smith, a weathered man with kind eyes who sometimes did business with Silas, to take her in his wagon for a small fee, payable upon her return with goods. She left Martha in charge, with strict instructions and a list of chores, a responsibility Martha accepted with a sullen sort of pride. Thomas, despite his youth, was now the man of the house in Ilara's absence, a role he seemed to embrace with quiet solemnity. Ilara clutched the small tin box of coins, Silas's last provision, like a talisman. Redemption was larger than she expected, a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a cacophony of wagons, horses, and shouting men. It was overwhelming after the isolation of the farm. Albright's general store was the biggest establishment, its windows displaying everything from sacks of flour to bolts of cloth and shiny new tools. Mr. Albright himself was a portly man with spectacles perched on his nose and a keen, appraising gaze. He listened patiently as Ilara, her voice low but steady, explained her situation. She omitted the detail of her mail-order arrival, simply stating she was a kinswoman come to care for Silas Blackwood's orphan children. Blackwood, yes. A tragedy, that, Albright said, his expression softening somewhat. Good man. Hard worker. Terrible luck with that last crop failure, and then the sickness. He looked at the meager collection of coins Ilara placed on the counter. "This won't go far, Miss Vance," Ilara supplied. Ilara vanced Miss Vance. "7 children, you say?" "That's a heavy burden. They're good children," Ilara said firmly. "They need food, winter clothes, medicine for the little one. And seed for the spring, if we are to have any hope." Albright tapped his fingers on the counter, considering. Silas had credit here once. Always paid his debts, when he could. He paused. "Tell you what, Miss Vance. I'll extend you some credit. Based on his good name, and your clear determination. But it must be repaid. Come spring, with the first harvest, or sooner if you can." Relief washed over Ilara, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "Thank you, Mr. Albright. You won't regret this." She carefully selected her purchases: flour, sugar, salt, beans, smoked bacon, coffee, some sturdy wool for mending clothes, and a small bottle of laudanum for Clara's teething pains and Samuel's discomfort. She also bought a packet of winter vegetable seeds, hardy greens, turnips, carrots, things that might still grow if planted quickly. As Mr. Albright tallied the bill, a rough-looking man lounging by the stove, who had been listening with open curiosity, sauntered over. "7 kids, eh?" he said, his eyes lingering on Ilara in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Blackwood's place is a decent piece of land. Too much for a woman and a passel of brats to handle." "We will manage," Ilara said coolly, meeting his gaze without flinching. The man chuckled, a greasy sound. "Name's Grice. Hiram Grice. Got relations back east, Blackwood's cousins, I hear. They might be interested to know the state of things." A chill went through Ilara. This was an unexpected threat, a complication she hadn't foreseen. Mr. Albright cleared his throat loudly. "That'll be all, Miss Vance. Jedediah should be waiting out front." He gave Grice a pointed look. "Some folks got too much time on their hands, sticking their noses where they ain't welcome." Grice shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips, and ambled back to the stove. Ilara gathered her precious supplies, her mind racing. Relatives. Another claim on the farm, on the children. She thanked Mr. Albright again, her gratitude now tinged with a new anxiety. The ride back to the farm felt even longer. The encounter with Grice had cast a shadow over the small victory at the store. She now understood that their sanctuary, fragile as it was, could be threatened not just by hunger and cold, but by human greed. When she finally arrived, the sight of Thomas and Lily running out to meet the wagon, their faces alight with anticipation, pushed her anxieties to the back of her mind, at least for the moment. The children helped unload the supplies, their excitement over the full sacks and boxes a poignant reminder of how little they had. Even Martha's reserve seemed to melt a little at the sight of real coffee and a side of bacon. That evening, as they ate a more substantial meal than they'd had in weeks, Ilara felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had faced the outside world, secured their immediate needs, and stood her ground. But the threat Grice represented lingered. She was no longer just a caregiver, she was becoming a defender. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning of their fight. The rhythm of their days settled into a pattern dictated by necessity and the slow turning of the season. Autumn deepened, the prairie grasses turning gold and bronze, the air carrying a crisp bite that heralded the coming winter. Ilara, with Thomas as her earnest lieutenant, worked tirelessly. The overgrown vegetable garden was cleared, and with a desperate hope, she planted the winter seeds Mr. Albright had supplied. They mucked out the chicken coop, and with better feed, the hens began to lay more regularly. Bess, the old milk cow, was beyond reviving as a milker, but Thomas, showing a surprising aptitude, managed to trade her to a neighboring farmer, Mr. Henderson. A quiet, solitary man Silas had occasionally helped, for a pregnant sow and 2 young goats that promised milk in the spring. It was a small victory, hard won. Ilara taught the older children what she knew. Martha, despite her initial resistance, proved to be a quick learner with a needle, her mending skills becoming invaluable as they repaired worn clothing against the advancing cold. Ilara showed her how to make broth stretch, how to preserve the last of the garden's offerings, how to manage their dwindling supplies with careful economy. Thomas absorbed everything about the farm, his quiet observations translating into capable action. He learned to set snares for rabbits, adding precious meat to their pot. Lily and Rose, once timid shadows, began to blossom under Ilara's patient tutelage. She taught them their letters using Silas's old ledger, and in the evenings, by the light of the fire, she would read to them from her mother's worn Bible or the single volume of poetry she possessed. Their laughter, when it came, was a fragile, precious sound. Samuel, his arm healing well, was put in charge of firewood, a task he took to with surprising diligence, his earlier defiance slowly giving way to a grudging respect for Ilara's fairness and resilience. Even Finn contributed, his small hands eagerly helping to gather eggs or feed the precious new goats. The house itself began to feel more like a home. Ilara insisted on cleanliness and order, but also on small comforts. She found an old, patched quilt and hung it over the draftiest window. She encouraged the children to draw pictures, which she tacked to the walls, adding touches of color to the drab interior. The evenings, once filled with a heavy silence or Clara's fretful cries, now often held the murmur of Ilara reading, the children's quiet questions, the crackle of the fire. Clara, thriving on regular, if supplemented, feedings and Ilara's calm care, was becoming a chubby, gurgling baby, her smiles a balm to their weary spirits. Martha watched Ilara, her gaze often unreadable. The sharp edges of her grief and resentment were slowly softening, though a core of sadness remained. She saw Ilara's unwavering dedication, the way she put the children's needs before her own, often eating last and least. She saw the lines of worry etched around Ilara's eyes, the weariness in her posture at the end of a long day. One evening, as Ilara was darning socks by the firelight, Martha spoke, her voice unusually hesitant. "My mother, she used to sing to us." Ilara looked up, surprised. She had a beautiful voice, Martha continued, her gaze distant. I barely remember it now." Ilara set down her mending. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we can make some new songs." She didn't try to replace their lost mother. She knew she never could. But she could offer them a new sense of belonging, a different kind of warmth. Slowly, painstakingly, they were forging a new family from the ashes of their shared losses. The farm, too, reflected their efforts. The fields were still fallow, awaiting spring, but the yard was tidy, the fences mended where possible, the buildings looking less like they were about to collapse. It was a fragile piece, a hard-won stability, but it was theirs. Ilara knew the winter would be a severe test. Their supplies were limited, their resources stretched thin. But as she looked at the children, their faces illuminated by the fire, a quiet determination filled her. They had come this far. They would face whatever came next, together. She was no longer just Ilara Vance, the mail-order bride who had arrived to find nothing she expected. She was becoming something more, something vital to this small, resilient group. She was their anchor, their protector, and, in all the ways that truly mattered, their mother. The first snows of winter arrived early, blanketing the prairie in a pristine, silent white. The beauty of it was deceptive, a cold shroud that highlighted their vulnerability. Their carefully hoarded supplies began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The small cabin grew colder, despite the constantly burning fire. It was during this bleak period that Hiram Grice reappeared. He arrived unannounced on a biting cold afternoon, his horse stamping impatiently in the snow-drifted yard. He didn't bother to knock, simply pushed open the door and strode in, bringing a gust of frigid air and a palpable sense of menace. The children, gathered around the hearth for warmth and a meager lunch of bean soup, froze. Lily and Rose instinctively pressed closer to Ilara. Well, Grice said, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in their poverty, their huddled forms. "Cozy little nest you got here, Miss Vance." Ilara rose slowly, placing herself between Grice and the children. "Mr. Grice. This is an unexpected visit, just checking on my kin's property," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a letter here from Josiah Blackwood. Silas's cousin back in Ohio. Seems he's the rightful heir to this place. And guardian to these young uns." He tapped the paper. "Says he's concerned for their welfare. Might be he'll be out himself come spring. Or he might just ask me to manage things on his behalf." Martha, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her eyes blazing. This is our home. Pa left it to us. Grice chuckled. PA's wishes don't mean much against the law, girlie. Especially when there's minors involved and no proper will. He looked pointedly at Ilara. And a woman of no relation trying to run things. Doesn't look good. Ilara's heart sank. She had feared this. The law, in such matters, was often a blunt instrument, uncaring of the human cost. The children are well cared for, Ilara stated, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. They are fed, clothed, and loved. What more could this Josiah Blackwood offer them that they don't have here? Stability, Grice sneered. Proper legal guardianship. Maybe even a place in an orphanage back east if he don't want the trouble of them himself. Less mouths to feed, more profit from the land, eh? The word orphanage hung in the air like a death sentence. Ilara saw the terror in the children's eyes. Even Samuel looked pale. You will not take them, Ilara said, her voice now ringing with a fierce conviction she hadn't known she possessed. This farm is their birthright. We will work it. We will make it prosper. The Grice laughed outright. You? And this bunch of half-starved whelps? Don't make me laugh, lady. This land will be sold or leased to someone who knows what to do with it. Someone like me, perhaps. Josiah seems amenable to a fair offer. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Maybe there's a way you could stay on. Keep house for me. A woman alone needs protection out here. The insinuation was clear and vile. Ilara recoiled as if struck. Get out, she said, her voice low and shaking with fury. Get out of this house. Grice seemed taken aback by her vehemence. He held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, all right. No need to get hysterical. Just delivering a message. You'll be hearing more. Come spring, things are gonna change around here. He gave the children one last, dismissive look, then turned and strode out, leaving the door open to the biting wind. Thomas rushed to slam it shut. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The fragile peace they had built felt shattered. Lily began to cry, and Rose soon joined her. Finn buried his face in Ilara's skirt. Samuel stared at the door, his small fists clenched. Martha looked at Ilara, her earlier defiance replaced by a stark fear. Is it true? She whispered. Can he do that? Ilara pulled Finn closer, her mind racing. She didn't know the intricacies of the law, but Grice's threats felt chillingly real. I don't know, Martha, she admitted honestly. But we won't let him win. We will fight this, but how? They were isolated, poor, and now, directly threatened. The hopeful future she had begun to envision for them seemed to be dissolving like mist in the harsh winter wind. The warmth of their small home suddenly felt terribly inadequate against the cold, predatory world outside. The days following Grice's visit were shrouded in a pall of anxiety. Every knock on the door, every distant rider, sent a fresh wave of fear through the small household. Ilara tried to maintain a semblance of normality for the children, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Sleep offered little respite, her nights filled with troubled dreams of separation and loss. She knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. Their best hope lay in redemption, with Mr. Albright, or perhaps the circuit preacher who occasionally visited the area, if he could be found. With a heavy heart, Ilara prepared for another journey to town, leaving Martha and Thomas once more in charge. This time, the purpose was not just supplies, but counsel, and perhaps, salvation. Mr. Henderson, their quiet neighbor, agreed to take her. He had heard Grice's horse that day and, though he said little, his weathered face showed concern when Ilara briefly explained the situation. Mr. Albright listened to Ilara's account with a grim expression. Hiram Grice is a troublemaker, he said, shaking his head. And Josiah Blackwood? I remember Silas mentioning him. A grasping sort, from what I recall. This doesn't surprise me. Is there anything we can do? Ilara asked, her voice tight with apprehension. The law is tricky with inheritance, Miss Vance. Especially when there's no clear will and the beneficiaries are children. Grice might be blowing smoke, or he might have a legitimate claim on behalf of this cousin. He paused, tapping his chin thoughtfully. The circuit judge, Judge Miller, is due in redemption in a few weeks. He's a fair man, by most accounts. If you could present your case to him, show that the children are well cared for, that this is their home. But Grice said he could have us removed before then. Ilara worried. Albright sighed. He could try to get the local magistrate to issue an order. It depends on how much influence he wields. For now, the best defense is to demonstrate stability. That you are a fit guardian. He looked at her kindly. You've done wonders out there, Miss Vance. Everyone who passes by the Blackwood place says so. It's not the same derelict farm it was. Just then, the door to the store opened and the local pastor, Reverend Davies, entered. He was a stern-looking but ultimately kind man who had officiated at Silas's funeral. Mr. Albright quickly apprised him of the situation. Reverend Davies listened intently, his brow furrowed. "This is grievous news," he said. "Those children have suffered enough. Hiram Grice is not a man to be trusted with their welfare, nor is a distant relative who has shown no interest until now." He looked at Ilara. "Your dedication to them, Miss Vance, is clear. It speaks volumes. I will attest to it myself, should it come to that." He then offered a piece of practical advice. "Gather testimony. From Mr. Henderson, from anyone else who has seen your efforts. Show that the children are thriving under your care, not neglected. And pray, my dear. Prayer can move mountains." Ilara felt a small measure of hope return. She wasn't entirely alone. Mr. Albright promised to make discreet inquiries about Josiah Blackwood and Grice's legal standing. Reverend Davies offered to write a letter to Judge Miller, outlining the situation and vouching for Ilara's character. On the journey back to the farm, Ilara felt a renewed, if still fragile, sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but now she had allies. When she arrived, she found the children anxious but resolute. Martha had organized them into a defensive unit of sorts. Thomas had sharpened an old axe, and even Samuel had a sturdy stick he declared was for whacking Grice. Ilara gathered them around the fire that evening. "We have friends in redemption," she told them. "Mr. Albright and Reverend Davies will help us. And Mr. Henderson will speak for us too." She saw the relief on their faces. "But we also need to help ourselves. We need to show everyone that this is our home, and we belong here together." In the days that followed, a new energy filled the small cabin. They worked with a fierce determination, not just for survival, but to build their case. Martha meticulously documented their meager stores and how they were managed. Thomas redoubled his efforts on the farm, ensuring the animals were well tended, the woodpile high. Lily and Rose practiced their letters with renewed enthusiasm, and even helped Ilara draft a simple letter to Judge Miller, in their childish script, pleading to stay in their home. Ilara, drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed, prepared to fight for these children, for their future, for the found family they had become. The threat of Grice and the unknown cousin still loomed, but now, it was met not with despair, but with a united, resilient spirit. Spring arrived tentatively, then with a rush of pale green across the prairie. The sow Mr. Henderson had traded them farrowed a healthy litter of piglets, and the goats produced their first, precious milk. The winter vegetable seeds Ilara had planted in hope against hope sprouted, offering the promise of fresh food. The farm, under their combined efforts, was slowly stirring back to life. But the shadow of Josiah Blackwood and Hiram Grice remained. Word reached them through Mr. Albright that Judge Miller would indeed be holding court in redemption in 2 weeks. Grice had been boasting openly in town that he would soon have control of the Blackwood property. The tension in the small cabin was palpable. Ilara spent her evenings coaching Martha and Thomas on what to say if they were questioned, though her heart ached at the thought of putting them through such an ordeal. She herself rehearsed her plea, trying to find words that would convey the depth of their bond, the children's desperate need for stability and love. The day before they were due to travel to redemption for the hearing, a small, unexpected miracle occurred. A mud-spattered buggy, driven by a tired-looking woman in her late 40s, pulled into their yard. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle, a representative of the Prairie Women's Benevolent Society, an organization Ilara had never heard of. Reverend Davies wrote to us, Mrs. Periwinkle explained, her gaze taking in Elara, the children who had gathered curiously, and the modest but clear improvements to the farm. He told us about your situation, Miss Vance. About the children, and the threat from this Mr. Gryce. Elara, stunned, invited her in. Mrs. Periwinkle accepted a cup of precious coffee and listened intently as Elara recounted their story, from her arrival to Gryce's machinations. The children, sensing a potential ally, chimed in with their own observations, Thomas speaking of their work on the farm, Martha of how Elara had taught them, even Finn shyly presenting Mrs. Periwinkle with one of his carved birds. Mrs. Periwinkle's expression softened as she listened. "My dear Miss Vance," she said when they had finished. "You are a remarkable woman. What you have done here, for these children, it is a testament to courage and compassion." She then explained the purpose of her visit. The Society often intervenes in cases where children's welfare is at stake. We have some legal counsel, and we carry a certain weight with Judge Miller. He knows our work. She paused, a kind smile gracing her lips. "We believe your case is strong. We are prepared to stand with you." Tears welled in Elara's eyes. This was more than she could have hoped for. An advocate, someone with experience and influence. The next day, they journeyed to Redemption not as a desperate, isolated family, but as part of a small, determined contingent. Mrs. Periwinkle rode with them, her calm presence a source of immense reassurance. Mr. Albright and Reverend Davies met them at the makeshift courthouse. Mr. Henderson was also there, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but resolute. Hiram Gryce was already present, smirking confidently, a lawyerly man by his side. The courtroom was crowded. Judge Miller, a stern-faced man with surprisingly kind eyes, called the case of the Blackwood estate. Gryce's lawyer presented his arguments first, painting a picture of neglect and incompetence, claiming Josiah Blackwood was solely concerned for the children's well-being and the proper management of his late cousin's assets. Then it was Elara's turn. Mrs. Periwinkle spoke first, eloquently outlining Elara's dedication and the children's progress under her care. Reverend Davies and Mr. Albright offered their testimonies, vouching for Elara's character and the visible improvements to the farm and the children's spirits. Mr. Henderson spoke haltingly but sincerely about the hard work he had witnessed. Finally, Judge Miller looked at Elara. "Miss Vance," he said. "What do you have to say?" Elara stood, her heart pounding, but her voice clear. She spoke not of legalities, but of love, of duty, of the home they had forged together. She spoke of each child, their fears, their hopes, their resilience. She described their daily lives, the small victories, the shared purpose. She concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "These children are not assets, Your Honor. They are a family. This farm is not just land, it is their home, their only connection to their father. To remove them, to separate them, would be a cruelty beyond measure. All I ask is the chance to continue to care for them, to give them the future their father wished for them." When she finished, a hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Miller looked at Gryce, then at Elara and the children, who sat quietly, their eyes fixed on him. He cleared his throat. "It is the opinion of this court," he began slowly, "that the welfare of these children is paramount. I have heard compelling testimony to Miss Vance's character and her devoted care. I have also noted the opportunistic nature of Mr. Josiah Blackwood's sudden interest." He paused. "Therefore, I am appointing Miss Elara Vance as temporary legal guardian of the Blackwood children, with stewardship of the farm until the eldest child, Martha Blackwood, comes of age. Mr. Gryce, your petition on behalf of Mr. Josiah Blackwood is denied." A collective gasp, then a wave of murmurs swept the room. Elara felt Martha's hand clutch hers. Thomas let out a shaky breath. Relief, so profound it was dizzying, washed over Elara. They had won. Gryce was sputtering, his face purple with rage, but Judge Miller banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. As they left the courthouse, blinking in the sudden sunlight, Mrs. Periwinkle squeezed Elara's arm. "You did it, my dear." The children crowded around Elara, their faces shining. They were safe. Their home was safe. The community, their unexpected allies, had helped them face down the external threat, and they had emerged stronger, more united than ever. The journey back to the farm was a quiet triumph. The weight that had pressed down on them for so long had lifted, replaced by a lightness that Elara hadn't realized she'd been missing. The children chattered, their voices full of relief and future plans, what they would plant, how they would fix the barn roof, the names they would give the new kid goats. Elara listened, a soft smile playing on her lips, her heart full. That evening, after a celebratory meal of rabbit stew, a rabbit Thomas had proudly snared, and the last of their stored apples, a different kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the tense silence of anxiety, but the peaceful quiet of security, of belonging. Clara was asleep in her cradle, her breathing soft and even. Finn was curled up by the fire, already nodding off. Lily and Rose were looking at a picture book Mrs. Periwinkle had given them, their heads bent together. Samuel, for once, was still, idly whittling a piece of wood, a contented expression on his face. Martha sat beside Elara on the small bench near the hearth. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, a comforting sound. Finally, Martha turned to Elara, her expression serious, the shadows of her past grief still visible, but overlaid now with a newfound maturity. "Thank you, Elara," she said, her voice low but clear. "For everything. For staying. For fighting for us." Elara reached out and took Martha's hand. It was calloused from work, but strong. "You fought too, Martha. All of you did." "We did this together," Martha nodded, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. "Pa, he would have liked you," she said softly. "He worried so much about us. He just wanted us to be safe, to have a chance." A tear escaped and traced a path down Martha's cheek. "I miss him, I know," Elara said gently, her own eyes misting. "And it's all right to miss him. We won't ever forget him." She paused, then continued, "He left you a great legacy, Martha. Not just this farm, but the love he had for all of you. And he trusted me to help you protect that. It's an honor I try to live up to every day." Martha looked up, meeting Elara's gaze. The last vestiges of her old resentment seemed to dissolve, replaced by a deep, unwavering trust. "You're more than just helping, Elara," she said, a small, genuine smile finally gracing her lips. You're our family now." The words, spoken with such heartfelt sincerity, resonated deep within Elara. Outsider to insider. Reluctant caregiver to family. The transformation was complete, not just for the children, but for her too. This harsh, unforgiving land, this dilapidated farm, these 7 orphaned children, they had become her life, her purpose. The life she had envisioned when she first answered Silas Blackwood's advertisement was a pale imitation of the rich, challenging, meaningful existence she had found. She thought of Silas's letter, his desperate plea. "Forgive me," he had written. There was nothing to forgive. In his absence, through his children, he had given her the greatest gift of all, a place to belong, a reason to be strong, a family to love and be loved by in return. The scars of their shared past, the loss of parents, the threat of displacement, the grinding poverty, would always remain a part of their story. But they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of their resilience, of the battles they had faced and won together. Healing was a slow process, but it was happening, day by day, in the rhythm of their shared lives, in the warmth of the fire, in the certainty of their belonging to one another. Elara looked around the humble cabin, at the faces of the children who now looked to her with such open affection and trust. Her heart felt an ache of profound, quiet joy. This was home. Another year passed, marked by the turning of the seasons, each one etching deeper the bonds that held them together. The spring that followed their victory in court was one of fervent activity. With the threat of Grice removed and their tenure secure, they poured all their energy into the farm. Thomas, now a capable young man of 16, worked alongside Elara with an almost adult sense of responsibility, his knowledge of the land and animals growing daily. They planted the fields with corn and wheat, the seeds bought with a small loan from Mr. Albright, who now treated Elara with a mixture of respect and fatherly pride. Martha, her earlier burdens transformed into a quiet strength, managed the household with an efficiency that mirrored Elara's own. She had become Elara's right hand, a confidant and a partner in raising her younger siblings. The garden flourished under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables throughout the summer and ample produce for preserving. Lily and Rose, now 12, were no longer timid, but bright, inquisitive girls who excelled at their lessons with Ilara and contributed cheerfully to the farm chores. Samuel, at 10, had channeled his boisterous energy into becoming an adept hunter and fisherman, his contributions to their larder invaluable. Finn, a sturdy 8-year-old, was Thomas's shadow, eagerly learning the ways of the farm. And Clara, now a talkative toddler, was the cherished baby of the family, her laughter echoing through the once silent cabin, a constant reminder of their renewed joy. The farm itself reflected their hard work and dedication. Fences were mended and strong. The barn, once leaning precariously, now stood straighter, its roof patched. The house, while still humble, was a beacon of warmth and cleanliness, filled with the aroma of baking bread, the sounds of children's voices, and the murmur of stories read by firelight. Ilara watched them, a quiet contentment settling deep within her. She was no longer the hesitant mail-order bride who had arrived with such trepidation. She was Ilara Blackwood in all but name, the undisputed matriarch of this resilient, loving family. Her hands were calloused, her face weathered by sun and wind, but her eyes shone with a deep, abiding peace. She had found her purpose not in a marriage contract, but in the fertile soil of shared hardship and unwavering love. One crisp autumn evening, as the scent of wood smoke and roasting apples filled the air, they gathered around the large table Thomas had built. It was the anniversary of their court day, as Finn called it. A small celebration. The table was laden with the fruits of their labor, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from Martha's garden, and a freshly baked apple pie. The children's faces glowed in the lamplight. Ilara looked at each of them, her heart swelling. Martha, poised and confident. Thomas, strong and kind. Lily and Rose, their smiles bright. Samuel, his mischievousness now tempered with responsibility. Finn, his eyes full of adoration. And Clara, clapping her hands in delight. To family, Thomas said, raising his glass of cider, his gaze meeting Ilara's. To family, they all echoed. Later, as the younger children slept and Martha and Thomas discussed plans for the winter, Ilara stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was a canopy of brilliant stars, vast and beautiful. The prairie wind whispered through the tall grass, no longer a mournful sound, but a song of endurance. She thought of Silas Blackwood, the man whose unseen hand had guided her to this unexpected destiny. He had sought a wife, a helpmeet. He could never have imagined the fierce, loving mother his children would find in the woman who answered his call. Ilara Vance had arrived seeking a future. What she found was a far greater treasure, a home, a purpose, and a love that had taken root in the unlikeliest of soils and blossomed against all odds. She was no longer alone. She was surrounded by a family forged in adversity, bound by affection, and sustained by a resilience that was as vast and enduring as the prairie itself. This was her life. Hard won. Unexpected. And deeply, profoundly good.